All right, U.S. history class. As the Hulk informed you, this is Imperialism's second video. We're going to be talking about some of those other items on the list, and then I'm going to devote its own video, China to its own video. That'll help. Okay, so first things first. Most of this one I'm going to be talking about the Spanish-American War. So the Spanish-American War is a conflict that, according to the name, the U.S. gets involved with Spain, obviously. You've got a few factors going on here. One, you had Spain, which was a dying imperial power trying to hang on to its colonies, or at least the ones it had left. This includes Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. That's about all they had left. Spain had at one point controlled most of South America, had controlled large chunks of North America, and in the span of a couple hundred years had basically lost it all to either revolutions or other powers or anything, and what was left was just these few islands. Why was the U.S. interested in islands? Well, we've talked about that. It got them closer to their trade bases. It allowed them to control trade routes. This is all about trade. The U.S. isn't necessarily interested in conquering huge amounts of territory in the late 19th century, early 20th century. What they're interested in is controlling trade routes. And you do that by putting Navy bases on islands in areas where your ships are going to be going through. You can actually see a modern reflection of this. China is currently building islands in the South China Sea on, reefs and sandbanks, trying to do much the same thing, placing military bases in the flow of traffic, so if they have to, they can stop trade. All right, fair enough. So let's talk about this. So why does the U.S. go to war? Well, you can't just say, I want your stuff and go to war. That would be considered rude. So you have to have some sort of a reason, some sort of an excuse. The excuse in this case was the poor treatment of Cubans during a rebellion in Cuba. The Spanish had been locking Cubans up, locking whole villages up, and threatening to starve them to death if the rebels didn't surrender. The rebels didn't surrender, people died. You get the idea. Now, this is bad, no question, but what happened was a phenomenon called yellow journalism. In the United States, newspaper owners who wanted to see the U.S. go to war, partially because they were wealthy men who had an interest in the sugar plantations of Cuba, and partially because wars are really good for newspaper owners because they sell a lot of newspapers during wartime, they really turned these headlines from something bad to something extreme. And they made it seem like the worst, most egregious thing. You couldn't look at a newspaper in the United States without seeing horrible pictures of what was going on in Cuba. That got people mad. Then a U.S. battleship called USS Maine was visiting Havana Harbor and mysteriously blew up. Now, they didn't know at the time what had caused it. Turns out it was a boiler explosion, not a bomb, but the newspapers started to publish pictures of how we think the Spanish did this, and they had all kinds of pictures of mines and people, setting them off from the shore, that kind of thing. All complete conjecture, but it did the job. It got Americans upset to the point that the U.S. decides to go to war with Spain. All right. Teddy Roosevelt, our famous progressive president, before he's president, gets involved in the Spanish-American War. He actually resigns as the Secretary of Navy to get involved in this, to lead a group of volunteers called the Rough Riders, which is a little bit of a lie because they didn't actually have any horses when they went to the battle, so they should have been called Rough Runners, into combat with the Spanish. This was one of the most one-sided wars in American history. The Spanish fleet was pretty pathetic. They did not have a lot left. Their fleet was old, it was weak, their military could not really defend their possessions. This was a pretty rotten power that we were kicking over, and that's exactly what it is. The American fleet steamed into Manila Bay in the Philippines and just wiped them out, to the point that they actually had to pull back to let the smoke clear, and they gave the men breakfast while they were waiting for the smoke to clear. Then they went back in and destroyed the rest of the Spanish fleet. Puerto Rico and Cuba fell in reasonably short order. The U.S. lost more troops to things like yellow fever and dysentery than we did to Spanish bullets. This was a very one-sided campaign. The end result of this campaign is that the United States gains some very important territories. As you can see up here, Cuba which had extensive sugar plantations, was 90 miles from the American coast, south coast of Florida, and had been something that we'd been talking about gaining since we wrote, the Articles of Confederation. Puerto Rico, right next door, some of the similar benefits, and the Philippines, along with the island of Guam. And the Philippines is important because where is the Philippines? The Philippines is not at all far from both Japan and China. These places we were looking at trying to trade with. Why do you want a base right close by? Because that allows you to ship goods there and then sell them out of this very close set of islands. The Philippines becomes U.S. possession and would be for quite a while, and we would use that as a way to distribute our goods to the Chinese market, and that was very, very important. That's why we wanted it. Side benefit, of course, the Philippines also grows sugar. Keep in mind, sugar is one of the most addictive substances on the planet. Most of the human population is addicted to it at this point in one way, shape, or form. And there was a big market in this. Hence, all of these are sugar islands, along with their other designations of being important naval islands. Keep in mind, Cuba and Puerto Rico also allow you to control the Caribbean more easily. That gives you Navy bases right down in the Caribbean, and we were attempting to control the Caribbean at this point. We viewed it as our sea, as our sort of subject states, and we were going to police them. We were going to manage them. That would become Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy and the Roosevelt corollary, which basically stated that nobody else gets to mess around in North and South America. Okay, moving on to Latin America. Latin America is another term for sort of Central America. You have the Dominican Republic, which is a Caribbean island, but is often lumped in there. This was a place that had borrowed a lot of money from European nations. You couldn't pay it back. European nations were threatening to invade. So what happened was the U.S. invaded, took control of the government, and said, all right, we are going to make sure that you collect enough tax and pay this back, and then we will leave. That's exactly what we did. Panama. Panama is important because what gets built in Panama? The Panama Canal. Why do we care about the Panama Canal? Because before the Panama Canal, ships had to go all the way around South America, a long and dangerous trip. By building a canal in Panama, which was quite a challenge, it required blasting our way through a mountain range, you were able to cut all of South America off of that trip. It made getting to China from, say, New York or Philadelphia much, much cheaper, much faster, and hence more profitable. It also allowed the U.S. to collect tolls on that, which was a big bonus. We would collect tolls on that for about a century until the canal was handed back in the late 1990s to Panama. Now Panama collects those tolls. They're actually looking at expanding the canal as ships have gotten bigger. The old canal isn't quite big enough. Anyway, and then finally you've got Mexico. Mexico is, our neighbor. We have had wars with Mexico more than once. And the problem that Mexico has at the turn of the century is that Mexico is in a near constant state of rebellion and revolution. There are many people fighting over control of Mexico, so much so that it breaks up at one point and then comes back together. And the U.S. is constantly getting sucked into these things. U.S. troops are often protecting the border. U.S. troops are often, backing one side or another. It creates a lot of messes. So the U.S. is always getting involved in Mexican politics, even though it may not be to our best benefit. So this is sort of a general summary of imperialism up to this point. Keep in mind that we see, along with Hawaii and the other stuff we've talked about, Japan, we're still seeing this focus on islands for the most part. I mean, okay, Panama's not an island, but it is an important naval situation. Mexico's a little bit the oddball out here, but all the rest of these are islands. And we're really looking for Navy bases and sugar islands. And those Navy bases are all leading us to China. All right, so we will very shortly be posting one last video to talk about issues China-related in this chapter, and we'll be moving on. Email me, text me if you need anything, and good luck.